The exhaustion that comes from fighting a broken medical system is a very specific type of bone-deep fatigue. It is not the physical tiredness of working a double shift. It is a relentless, suffocating pressure that sits heavily on your chest every single morning. When my 7-year-old son, Leo, was diagnosed with severe autism, I did not cry. I simply opened a notebook and began researching. Leo was brilliant, but he was entirely nonverbal and suffered from intense sensory processing issues. He needed an immersive, specialized occupational and speech therapy program that was not covered by my standard health insurance. The cost of the 2-year program was exactly $50,000. For 6 grueling months, I spent every free moment filling out applications, writing desperate letters, and submitting endless stacks of medical documentation to private foundations across the country. I worked late into the night, sitting at the small desk in my living room, while my younger sister, Suzanne, sat on my couch taking selfies for her social media accounts. Suzanne was currently living in my guest room rent-free. She had recently gone through a dramatic breakup with a wealthy boyfriend, and had moved in with me under the pretense of needing a few weeks to get back on her feet. A few weeks had turned into 4 months. Suzanne was fundamentally allergic to responsibility. She viewed the world entirely through the lens of aesthetics, deeply resentful of the fact that Leo's diagnosis had shifted our parents' attention, and mine, away from her endless social dramas. She frequently complained that the house was too loud when Leo had a meltdown, or that my constant focus on medical grants was depressing. I usually ignored her complaints, too exhausted to argue. Last Tuesday, I received an email from the Carson Pediatric Foundation. They had officially approved my application. The $50,000 medical grant had been awarded to Leo. I had cried that night. I had fallen to my knees in the kitchen, overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing relief that my son was finally going to get the help he desperately needed. The foundation director had assured me the funds would be wired directly into my designated account within 10 business days. Today was the 10th business day. I was sitting at my office desk during my lunch break, my heart beating rapidly with anticipation. I logged into my online banking portal, expecting to see the massive deposit clearing in my checking account. I planned to call the therapy center the moment the funds were secured to officially enroll Leo for the fall session. The portal loaded. My account balance was exactly $1,200. I frowned, refreshing the page. The balance remained the same. A cold knot of anxiety formed in my stomach. I opened a new tab and logged directly into the Carson Foundation's applicant portal. I navigated to the disbursement section, my eyes scanning the small text at the bottom of the screen. Status: funds disbursed. Completed. Date of transfer: 2 days ago. The knot in my stomach tightened into a hard, suffocating rock. I picked up my cell phone and immediately dialed the direct line for the Foundation's financial officer, a kind woman named Mrs. Higgins, who had helped me through the final stages of the application. "Mrs. Higgins," I said, trying to keep the rising panic out of my voice. "This is Laura. I am looking at the portal, and it says the funds were disbursed 2 days ago, but they have not appeared in my account." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of a keyboard clicking rapidly. "Hello, Laura," Mrs. Higgins replied, her tone perfectly calm. "Let me pull up your file." "Yes, I see the transfer right here. The $50,000 cleared on Wednesday morning. Did you check the new account you authorized?" I froze, the air completely leaving my lungs. "The new account?" I repeated blindly. I never authorized a new account. I provided my primary checking account information 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Higgins sounded confused. "Laura, we received a signed authorization form from your primary email address on Monday evening, requesting an urgent change of routing numbers due to a compromised bank card. The funds were routed exactly as requested. A wave of absolute terror washed over me. I hung up the phone without another word. I opened my email client, my hands shaking violently as I navigated to my sent folder. There was nothing there. I opened the deleted items folder. Sitting at the very bottom of the trash bin was an email sent on Monday evening, addressed to Mrs. Higgins. Attached to the email was a perfectly forged PDF authorization form, complete with my digital signature, directing the $50,000 grant into a different routing number. I recognized that routing number immediately. It belonged to a high-yield savings account at a premium national bank. It was the exact bank my sister Suzanne bragged about using, because they offered exclusive concierge services for wealthy clients. The terrifying reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. Suzanne had not just been taking selfies on my couch. She had been watching me type my passwords. She had waited until I went to sleep, logged into my email, intercepted the foundation's communications, and forged my digital signature. My own sister had stolen $50,000. She had stolen my son's voice. She had stolen his therapy, his future, and his chance at a normal life. I sat frozen in my office chair, staring at the deleted email. The betrayal was so profoundly evil, so utterly devoid of human empathy, that my brain simply could not process it as reality. She had watched me cry tears of relief in the kitchen, knowing full well she had already diverted the money into her own account. They say that when a mother perceives a lethal threat to her child, the panic eventually subsides, replaced by a cold, primal instinct to destroy the predator. The panic was already fading. The predator was sleeping in my guest room. And she had absolutely no idea what she had just unleashed. My immediate instinct, raw and violent, was to leave the office, drive straight home, and drag my sister out of my house by her expensive hair extensions. I wanted to scream until my throat bled. I wanted to stand in the living room and demand exactly how she could look at her nonverbal nephew and justify stealing the only key to his future. But anger, while a powerful fuel, is a terrible strategist. If I went home and confronted Suzanne now, I would lose every tactical advantage I possessed. She would undoubtedly play the victim, spin a web of elaborate lies, and claim it was a bank error or a misunderstanding. More importantly, it would give her the opportunity to panic, transfer the funds into an offshore account, and delete the digital trail on my computer. I could not let her know that the trap had already been triggered. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I packed my laptop into my bag, told my manager I was taking a half day for a family emergency, and walked out of the building. I drove straight to the specialized learning center where Leo spent his afternoons. When I walked into his classroom, he was sitting quietly in the corner, meticulously stacking colorful wooden blocks into a perfect, symmetrical tower. He did not look up when I entered, his deep brown eyes entirely focused on the geometry of his creation. I knelt down beside him, carefully placing a hand on his small shoulder. He leaned into my touch, a silent acknowledgement that anchored me back to reality. Looking at him, completely innocent and entirely unaware that his own aunt had just stolen his chance to learn how to speak, the anger inside me crystallized into something terrifyingly cold. "We need to go, buddy," I whispered, gently packing his blocks into his backpack. "We are going to have a sleepover tonight." I knew I could not go back to my house. I needed a secure environment where I could process the magnitude of the betrayal and build a flawless legal trap without Suzanne monitoring my expressions. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for my best friend, Sarah. Sarah lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood about 40 minutes away, and she had been my unwavering support system since Leo's diagnosis. Sarah answered on the second ring. Laura. Is everything okay? You usually do not call during work hours. I need a massive favor, I said, my voice finally cracking slightly under the strain. Can Leo and I stay in your guest room tonight? I cannot go home. You do not even have to ask, Sarah said instantly, the concern sharp in her voice. The door is unlocked. Come straight here. When we arrived at Sarah's house, I got Leo settled in the spare bedroom with his favorite weighted blanket and his tablet. He was content, perfectly safe in his own quiet world. Sarah handed me a mug of hot tea and led me into her kitchen, pulling out a chair at the table. Talk to me, she said, sitting across from me. What did she do? Sarah already knew that my relationship with Suzanne was strained, but she had no idea how deep the rot actually went. I stared down at the dark tea, the reflection of the overhead lights trembling slightly as my hands shook. She stole the medical grant, Sarah. She hacked into my email, forged my signature on a transfer authorization, and diverted the $50,000 into her own high-yield account. The foundation confirmed it. The money is gone. Sarah dropped her mug onto the table with a loud clatter, the hot liquid splashing over the rim. She just stared at me, her mouth slightly open, completely unable to process the absolute depravity of the statement. She stole $50,000 from her autistic nephew. Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with sudden, explosive rage. Laura, we need to call the police right now. We need to send them to your house. No, I said sharply, gripping the edge of the table. No local police. Local police will treat it as a domestic dispute. They will ask questions, she will lie, and the money will disappear into a crypto wallet before they can even file a report. This is federal wire fraud. It involves a massive medical foundation. I need the federal authorities, and I need a flawless paper trail. I stood up, excusing myself to the guest bathroom. I locked the door, turned on the faucet to muffle the sound, and finally allowed myself to break down. I wept silently, sliding down the cold tile wall until I was sitting on the floor. I cried for the exhaustion of the last 6 months. I cried for the absolute cruelty of the universe. And I cried for the sister I used to have, mourning the final, undeniable realization that she was a monster. The grief was suffocating, but it was necessary. I needed to purge every ounce of empathy I had left for Suzanne. If I was going to ruin her life, I could not afford to feel sorry for her. After 20 minutes, the tears completely stopped. My chest felt hollow, but my mind was operating with surgical precision. The grieving sister had washed down the drain. I stood up, splashed freezing water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. Suzanne wanted $50,000. I was going to make sure it cost her exactly 10 years in federal prison. I unlocked the bathroom door and walked back out. It was time to build the trap. When someone commits a massive financial crime against a family member, logic dictates that they should lay low. They should hide the money in a quiet account, act completely normal, and avoid drawing any attention to their sudden windfall. But Suzanne was not a logical criminal. She was a narcissist entirely addicted to the validation of strangers on the internet. And narcissists cannot resist the urge to immediately flaunt their stolen victories. I sat at Sarah's kitchen table, opening my laptop. The first rule of building a federal fraud case is to secure the digital footprint before the suspect realizes they are being investigated. I opened my web browser and navigated straight to Suzanne's public Instagram profile. Suzanne had over 10,000 followers, a curated audience she desperately sought to impress with an illusion of generational wealth. Her feed was usually filled with carefully angled photos taken inside expensive restaurants that she could not actually afford, often paid for by the wealthy ex-boyfriend she had recently lost. I clicked on her daily stories. The small purple ring around her profile picture began to load. The first video was a boomerang clip of Suzanne holding a flute of expensive champagne, clinking it against a manicured fingernail. The text overlaid on the screen read, "Finally manifesting the life I deserve. The universe always provides." I tapped the screen to move to the next story. It was a screenshot of a first-class flight itinerary. The departure date was scheduled for this coming Friday. The destination was Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. The itinerary also showed connecting luxury train tickets to Milan and Monaco. My breath caught in my throat. I tapped the screen again. The next photo was a picture of 3 massive, cream-colored shopping bags from a high-end designer boutique in the city center. The caption read, "Retail therapy is the best therapy. Treating myself to a massive wardrobe upgrade before Europe. Living in a stressful environment takes a toll on your mental health. It is time to put myself first." The stressful environment she was referring to was my house. The toll on her mental health was the occasional noise my autistic son made when he was overwhelmed. She had literally stolen his medical grant to buy designer handbags and fly first class to Paris, framing it as a well-deserved mental health break. I felt Sarah leaning over my shoulder, staring at the glowing screen of the laptop. "Laura," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "She is spending the grant money right now. She is booking international flights." "I know," I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single story, every post, and every timestamp. I saved them to a secure, encrypted cloud folder. I needed more than just Instagram posts. I needed the technical proof of the forgery to hand over to the federal authorities. I logged into my primary email provider and pulled the metadata log for my account. The security dashboard clearly showed the login history, including the exact IP address and the device used to access the account. I scanned the list, finding the login timestamp that matched the fraudulent email sent to Mrs. Higgins on Monday night. The time logged was 2:14 a.m. The device listed was my own living room desktop computer, and the IP address belonged to my home router. I had been asleep in my bedroom. Suzanne had crept into the living room, guessed the password to my desktop, and intercepted the Foundation's emails. She had downloaded the authorization PDF, forged my signature, and typed in the routing number for her concierge bank account. The sheer audacity of the crime was breathtaking. She had executed federal wire fraud and identity theft in her pajamas on my living room couch. "Do we call the bank?" Sarah asked, pacing the length of the kitchen. "If she is spending $50,000 this fast, she is going to drain the account before Friday." I stared at the screenshot of Suzanne's first-class itinerary. "No," I said slowly, a cold, strategic plan rapidly forming in my mind. The Foundation transferred the money via an automated clearinghouse wire. Because it is a large sum from a medical trust, the receiving bank will automatically place a percentage of the funds on a compliance hold for 48 hours to clear fraud protocols. She has only been able to spend a fraction of it so far using credit ad Steve's against the incoming balance. The bulk of the money is still sitting in escrow at her bank. "If I call her bank right now," I explained, looking up at Sarah, "they will freeze the account immediately, but Suzanne will get an alert. She will know she has been caught. She will delete her digital footprint, cancel the flights, and claim her phone was hacked. She will try to slither out of the legal consequences. Then what do we do?" Sarah asked, stopping in the middle of the kitchen. "We let her board the plane," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Sarah stared at me, her eyes wide. "You want to let her fly to Europe with Leo's therapy money?" "No," I replied, closing the laptop with a sharp click. "I want to let her scan her boarding pass and sit in her first-class seat. I want her to land in Paris feeling like an absolute queen. Because the moment her plane touches down in France, the federal fraud detectives are going to freeze every single asset she possesses, and she is going to be stranded in a foreign country, with a completely dead credit card and an international warrant waiting for her at the hotel lobby. I picked up my cell phone. The investigation was over. It was time to call the foundation and drop the hammer. My first phone call was not to the police. It was back to Mrs. Higgins at the Carson Foundation. When I explained that the routing change had been fraudulent and that my digital signature had been forged by a family member living in my house, the kind financial officer gasped audibly. I immediately instructed her not to contact the receiving bank to reverse the wire just yet. I explained that if the bank froze the account right now, my sister would be alerted, and she would simply deny everything, claiming it was a terrible error, or that I was framing her to ruin her vacation. I needed the foundation to contact their internal fraud department and quietly open a federal wire fraud investigation. I needed the authorities to trace the money she was currently spending back to the stolen grant, creating an airtight criminal case that no expensive defense lawyer could ever unravel. Mrs. Higgins agreed. The Foundation's legal team would immediately notify the Federal White-Collar Crime Division, but they would keep the investigation completely silent until I gave them the signal. After hanging up the phone, I walked out onto Sarah's back porch. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the oak trees in the evening wind. I sat down on a wicker chair and looked up at the darkening sky. With the tactical decisions made and the trap officially set in motion, the adrenaline finally began to drain from my system. In its place came a wave of profound, suffocating grief. It is a terrifying thing to realize that you are about to permanently destroy a member of your own family. Suzanne was my only sister. We had shared a bedroom growing up. We had shared secrets, clothes, and childhood dreams. I remembered braiding her hair before her high school prom, and I remembered sitting next to her at our grandmother's funeral. She had always been vain, and she had always been terribly selfish, but I had spent my entire adult life convincing myself that underneath the superficial exterior, she still loved me. Sitting on that dark porch, I realized I had been actively lying to myself for years. Suzanne did not love me. She loved what I could provide for her. She loved my guest room, she loved my groceries, and she loved the fact that my responsible nature allowed her to remain completely irresponsible. But the moment my focus shifted to my disabled son, her primary source of comfort was threatened. And instead of supporting me, she had viewed my autistic child as an inconvenience, a noisy obstacle standing between her and the lifestyle she believed she was owed. I buried my face in my hands. The grief was incredibly heavy, but I did not try to push it away. I let myself mourn the sister I thought I had. I let myself mourn the family dynamic that was about to be irreversibly shattered. But as I sat there, the image of Leo stacking his colorful wooden blocks in the corner of his classroom flashed through my mind. He was so small, so entirely dependent on me to navigate a world that was terrifyingly loud and chaotic for his unique brain. He could not speak up for himself. He could not fight for his own future. I was the only shield he had. The tears stopped. The sorrow completely evaporated into the cool evening air. If I allowed Suzanne to get away with this, if I simply cancelled the transfer, and kicked her out of my house with a stern warning, I would be failing my son. I would be prioritizing the feelings of a narcissistic thief over the medical needs of a vulnerable child. My role as a sister died on that porch, completely overwritten by my role as a mother. I was no longer grieving. I was preparing for war. My cell phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was a text message from Suzanne. "Hey. When are you coming home?" The message read, I am doing some packing for my mental health trip this weekend. Do you mind if I borrow your large vintage leather suitcase? Mine is way too small for all the new clothes I bought today. I stared at the glowing text. She had stolen $50,000 from my disabled son to buy designer clothes, and now she was asking to borrow my favorite luggage to transport her stolen goods to Europe. The sheer, sociopathic audacity of the request was almost impressive. I took a slow, steady breath. I did not type out an angry paragraph. I did not accuse her. I simply gave her exactly enough rope to hang herself. I am staying at Sarah's house tonight with Leo, I typed, my thumbs moving steadily across the screen. We needed a quiet night away. You can absolutely use the leather suitcase. It is in the hall closet. Have a wonderful time packing. Thanks, Evie. You are the best. She replied instantly, followed by 3 heart emojis. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. She thought she had won. She thought I was completely oblivious. She was happily packing my suitcase with clothes bought with my son's therapy money, entirely unaware that she was packing for a trip that would end in a concrete cell. The grief was gone. The trap was armed. All I had to do now was wait for Friday. There is a popular misconception that healing from a profound betrayal requires you to find inner peace, practice forgiveness, and let go of your anger. People who say that have clearly never had to fight for the survival of a disabled child. For me, healing did not come from a yoga mat or a therapist's couch. Healing came from a sterile, brightly lit conference room at the Regional Federal Building, sitting across from a man named Detective Steve. Detective Steve worked for the Federal Financial Crimes Unit. He was a tall, stoic man with prematurely gray hair and the exhausted, focused demeanor of an investigator who spent his life tracking down corporate embezzlers and identity thieves. The legal team from the Carson Pediatric Foundation had expedited my case file directly to his desk on Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, I was sitting in his office, handing over a thick manila folder containing the digital evidence I had compiled. Steve opened the folder and slowly flipped through the pages. He examined the IP logs from my home router, the forged authorization PDF, and the high-resolution screenshots of Suzanne's Instagram stories flaunting her stolen wealth. He spent several minutes looking at the first-class itinerary to Paris. I must admit, Ms. Thomas, Steve finally said, closing the folder and leaning back in his chair. We usually have to spend weeks subpoenaing internet service providers to get this level of digital tracing. You have essentially handed us a fully packaged federal indictment with a neat little bow on top. I am a mother, detective, I replied quietly. When it comes to protecting my son, I do not believe in half measures. Can you recover the money? Steve nodded confidently. Yes. Because the Carson Foundation flagged the transaction immediately, the receiving bank placed the bulk of the $50,000 in a mandatory compliance hold. Your sister has been able to spend about $8,000 on credit at Steve's, but the core capital is frozen in escrow. The foundation will be fully reimbursed, and your son's therapy is completely secure. A massive, physical weight lifted off my chest. The suffocating anxiety that had been crushing my lungs for the past 48 hours finally evaporated. Leo was going to be okay. He was going to get his treatment. The predator had missed the vital organs. But there is a secondary issue, Steve continued, his gray eyes narrowing slightly. Your sister has committed wire fraud, identity theft, and the forgery of a federal medical grant. Because she used an electronic communication network to divert funds across state lines to a national bank, this is not a local misdemeanor. It is a severe federal felony. I understand, I said, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Steve leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Ms. Thomas, I have dealt with family fraud cases before. Often, the victim gets cold feet when they realize the severity of the consequences. If I authorize the arrest warrants today, the machinery of the federal justice system will engage. There is no taking it back. There is no dropping the charges, because she is your sister. She will face mandatory minimum sentencing. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed? I did not hesitate. I did not need to think about it. I pulled my cell phone out of my purse, opened the photo gallery, and slid the phone across the table. The screen displayed a photo of Leo. He was wearing his noise-canceling headphones, looking out the window of my car, his face completely calm and isolated in his own silent world. She looked at him, I told the detective, my voice completely devoid of warmth. She looked at that little boy, knowing how hard he struggles to navigate the world, and she decided that her desire to drink champagne in Paris was more important than his ability to learn how to speak. She is not my sister anymore. She is a thief. Do whatever you have to do. Steve looked at the photo, and a deep, profound respect settled over his features. He pushed the phone back to me and picked up his desk phone. What time does her flight land in Paris on Friday? Steve asked. 3:00 in the afternoon, local time, I replied. Steve dialed a number, holding the receiver to his ear. I will contact the International Liaison Office. We will have the French authorities waiting at the hotel lobby. They will detain her and arrange for immediate extradition back to the United States. I walked out of the federal building an hour later, stepping out into the bright morning sunlight. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean. The healing process had officially concluded. I felt a profound, untouchable sense of peace. I was no longer a victim scrambling to survive a betrayal. I was the architect of my sister's absolute destruction, and the blueprint was flawless. Now, all that remained was the waiting. Executing a successful trap against a narcissist requires you to completely suppress your own ego. You cannot confront them. You cannot show them how angry you are. You have to willingly play the role of the oblivious, exhausted victim they believe you to be, feeding their sense of superiority, until the very moment the steel jaws snap shut. On Wednesday evening, I sat in my living room, watching Suzanne drag my vintage leather suitcase out of the hall closet. She had spent the entire afternoon shopping, and was now carefully packing rows of expensive silk blouses and designer shoes into the luggage. I sat on the couch, drinking a glass of water, pretending to read a medical journal. My heart was completely steady. I felt no rage, only a clinical, detached observation. I needed to build an alliance, but not the kind that required a lawyer. I needed to build a psychological alliance with the illusion Suzanne had created. I needed her to board that plane on Friday morning feeling absolutely invincible. I watched her struggle to zip the overloaded suitcase. Do you need help with that? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly mild, infusing it with the familiar, exhausted tone she expected from me. Suzanne looked up, brushing a strand of perfectly styled blonde hair out of her eyes. No, I got it, she said, leaning her weight onto the suitcase until the zipper finally closed. I am just so ready for this trip, Laura. You have no idea how badly I need a mental reset. Living here has been so draining lately. I nodded slowly, letting the insult wash over me without reacting. I am sorry it has been stressful, I replied. I know Leo's schedule can be a lot to handle. I hope Paris gives you the break you need. Suzanne smiled, a bright, entirely hollow expression. It will. You know, you should really try to relax while I am gone. Stop stressing so much about the medical grants and the therapies. The universe will figure it out. You just have to manifest positive energy. I looked directly into her eyes. It was terrifying how easily the lies flowed from her mouth. She was standing in my living room, lecturing me about manifesting positive energy, while $50,000 of my son's stolen therapy money sat in her bank account. "I am sure the universe has a plan," I said softly. The next morning, I drove to work and immediately executed the second phase of my strategy. I knew that Suzanne had the password to my primary email account. If the Carson Foundation sent any automated updates regarding the fraud investigation, Suzanne might intercept them and realize the trap was set. I called Mrs. Higgins from my secure office line. "Mrs. Higgins," I said as soon as she answered, "I need you to place a strict communication block on my primary email address. Do not send any updates, receipts, or automated messages to that account. My sister still has access to it, and she monitors it." "I understand completely, Laura," Mrs. Higgins replied, her tone instantly shifting into professional high alert. "I will flag the account right now. The IT department will route all communications regarding the federal investigation exclusively to the secure work email you provided yesterday." "Thank you," I said. "Is there any movement from the receiving bank?" "Yes," Mrs. Higgins confirmed. "Detective Steve issued the federal subpoena early this morning. The bank has officially locked the account. The compliance hold is absolute. She currently has access to the credit line she ad-Steved against the balance, but she cannot withdraw a single dollar of the actual grant money." "Perfect," I replied. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my office chair. The alliance with the foundation was secure. The flow of information was completely controlled. Suzanne was operating in an absolute vacuum, believing she was a criminal mastermind, while in reality, every single move she made was being monitored and documented by a federal financial crimes unit. I spent the rest of the day working in quiet satisfaction. I did not feel the crushing exhaustion that had plagued me for the last 6 months. For the first time since Leo's diagnosis, I felt incredibly light. When I returned home that evening, Suzanne's bags were stacked by the front door. She was sitting on the couch, aggressively typing on her phone, likely arranging a luxury car service to take her to the airport the next morning. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of wine. I had built the alliances. I had gathered the evidence. I had played the oblivious sister flawlessly. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, the universe was finally going to deliver the exact energy Suzanne had manifested. A trap is only as effective as the mechanism that triggers it. In the realm of federal financial crimes, that mechanism is incontrovertible, documented evidence. If there is a single crack in the timeline, a skilled defense attorney can exploit it to create reasonable doubt. I was not going to allow my sister the luxury of reasonable doubt. Friday morning arrived. I woke up at 6 o'clock, helped Leo get dressed for school, and completely ignored the black luxury town car idling in my driveway. Suzanne marched down the stairs, wearing oversized designer sunglasses, and carrying my vintage leather suitcase. She barely acknowledged Leo, offering a flippant goodbye over her shoulder before climbing into the back of the town car and disappearing down the street. The predator had officially left the nest. I dropped Leo off at his specialized school and drove to the office. At exactly 10 o'clock, my secure office phone rang. It was Detective Steve. "Your sister's flight departed 40 minutes ago," Steve reported, his voice crisp and professional. "She is currently over the Atlantic Ocean. I have the IP logs and the forged digital signature, but the federal prosecutor wants to establish a definitive timeline of her spending to prove malicious intent. Do you have any idea what travel agency she used to book the flights? If we can subpoena the travel agency, we can prove she booked the tickets immediately after forging the bank transfer." "I do not know the name of the agency," I said, leaning back in my chair. "But she packed in a rush last night. Her bedroom is likely a disaster zone. Let me go home during my lunch break and do some digging. I drove back to my house just before noon. The silence in the living room was profound. I walked down the hallway and opened the door to the guest room. It looked like a luxury department store had exploded. Discarded clothes, empty shoeboxes, and plastic shopping bags covered every inch of the floor. Suzanne was so consumed by her own vanity that she had not even bothered to clean up her own mess before leaving for a month-long European vacation. I ignored the clothes and went straight for the small wicker trash bin tucked under the desk. Narcissists are often incredibly careless criminals. They are so focused on the reward that they forget to cover their tracks. I pulled out a crumpled pile of cosmetic packaging and coffee shop receipts. Near the bottom of the bin, I found a thick, glossy piece of paper folded in half. I smoothed it out on the desk. It was a physical invoice from a high-end, boutique travel agency located downtown. The invoice detailed the entire itinerary, the first-class flights to Paris, the luxury train tickets to Milan, and the deposit for a 5-star hotel in Monaco. The total bill was over $12,000. But what made my heart race was the payment method listed at the bottom of the invoice. It was an electronic check transfer, drawn directly from the routing number of the concierge bank account, where the stolen medical grant was currently sitting. The date on the invoice was Tuesday morning. She had booked the entire European vacation mere hours after forging my signature on Monday night. I pulled out my phone, activated the scanner app, and took a high-resolution PDF scan of the entire document. I immediately emailed the file directly to Detective Steve. 10 minutes later, Steve called me back. "Miss Thomas," Steve said, and for the first time since I met him, I could hear a distinct note of professional satisfaction in his voice. "This is the final nail in the coffin. This invoice proves she premeditated the theft specifically to fund a luxury vacation. The prosecutor just signed off on the federal arrest warrants. Are the French authorities ready?" I asked, walking out of the guest room and locking the door behind me. "The international liaison confirmed 5 minutes ago," Steve replied smoothly. "2 detectives from the French National Police will be waiting in the lobby of her hotel when she arrives from the airport. They have the extradition paperwork signed by a federal judge. The moment she attempts to check in, she will be detained." "Thank you, Detective," I said softly. I hung up the phone and stood in the hallway of my quiet house. The evidence was gathered. The timeline was established. The federal warrants were signed. Suzanne was currently flying 30,000 feet in the air, sipping champagne in a first-class cabin, entirely oblivious to the fact that her luxury vacation was going to end the moment her plane touched the ground. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a sandwich. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon. Arrogance is a fascinating psychological blind spot. When narcissists successfully execute a manipulation, they are rarely satisfied with simply getting away with it. They feel a deep, compulsive need to flaunt their perceived superiority over their victim. They want to stand on the edge of the cliff and wave down at the person they just pushed off, entirely unaware that the person at the bottom is holding the detonator to the bridge they are standing on. It was mid-afternoon on Friday. I was sitting at my office desk, reviewing some spreadsheets, when my cell phone vibrated across the smooth wood. The caller ID displayed my sister's name. The call was coming through an internet audio app, meaning she was connected to a Wi-Fi network abroad. She had landed in Paris. I let it ring 3 times, taking a slow, steadying breath to ensure my voice betrayed absolutely no emotion. I pressed answer and put the phone on speaker, resting it next to my keyboard. "Hi Suzanne," I said cheerfully. "Did you land safely?" "Laura." Suzanne's voice floated through the speaker, breathless and artificially sweet. "Yes. We just touched down at Charles de Gaulle. I am currently sitting in the VIP arrivals lounge waiting for my private car transfer to the hotel. It is absolutely gorgeous here. I am so glad, I replied smoothly. How was the flight? Oh, first class was incredible, she bragged. They served actual caviar before takeoff. You know, Laura, sitting on that plane really gave me some time to reflect on things. Did it? I asked, staring blankly at my computer monitor. It really did, Suzanne continued, her tone shifting from excited to condescending. I realized that you are just entirely too stressed out. You are wasting the best years of your life obsessing over Leo's autism and constantly chasing medical grants and therapy schedules. You are miserable, Laura. You really need to learn how to put yourself first, like I am doing. My jaw tightened. She was sitting in a Parisian VIP lounge, lecturing me on self-care, using the exact money she had stolen from my disabled son's therapy fund. The psychological cruelty was almost difficult to comprehend. It is hard to put myself first when Leo needs so much support, I said, keeping my tone perfectly indifferent. Well, you just need to manifest better outcomes, Suzanne said dismissively. Stop dwelling on the negative. By the way, I hope you figure out that whole grant money situation with the foundation. You are always stressing about finances, and it really ruins your energy. Just trust that the universe will provide. I stared at the phone. She was actually mocking me. She was standing inside the house she had just burned down, asking me why I was sweating. She was completely, dangerously intoxicated by her own greed. A year ago, a phone call like that would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and frustration. I would have spent the entire night wondering why my hard work was constantly belittled while her delusions were fiercely protected. But today, I felt absolutely nothing. Her insults were completely meaningless, because they were delivered by a ghost. The sister I grew up with ceased to exist the moment she forged my signature. You are absolutely right, Suzanne, I said softly. I think this weekend is going to be a massive learning experience for both of us. The universe definitely has a way of balancing the scales. Exactly. Suzanne chirped, entirely missing the lethal undertone in my voice. Anyway, my driver is here. I have to go check into my suite. I will send you some pictures from the balcony. Have a wonderful time, Suzanne, I replied. I hope the check-in process is completely unforgettable. I will. Bye. The call disconnected, and silence returned to my office, thick and heavy. I picked up the phone, staring at the darkened screen. She thought she was a mastermind. She thought she had asserted absolute dominance over her pathetic, exhausted older sister. She was happily walking toward a luxury car, completely unaware that she was walking into an inescapable international vault. I turned off my phone, closed my spreadsheets, and looked at the clock on the wall. It was nearly 4 o'clock in the afternoon in Paris. She was 30 minutes away from the hotel. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of my coffee. The enemy had launched her final attack, but she had fired blanks into a bulletproof wall. The real ammunition was waiting for her in the hotel lobby. The scene that unfolded in Paris was not something I witnessed personally, but Detective Steve later provided me with the detailed incident report filed by the French National Police. He read it to me over the phone, and the imagery was so vivid, so perfectly cinematic, that it felt as though I was standing right there in the marble lobby. It was late Friday afternoon when the black luxury town car pulled up to the curb of a historic, 5-star hotel near the Champs-Élysées. The doorman, dressed in a sharp uniform, opened the door, and my sister stepped out onto the Parisian sidewalk. According to the hotel's security footage, Suzanne walked through the revolving glass doors looking like she owned the building. She was wearing her oversized designer sunglasses, a silk scarf draped carelessly over her shoulders, and she was dragging my vintage leather suitcase behind her. She walked straight past the grand piano in the center of the lobby and approached the polished mahogany front desk. She presented her passport to the concierge, a distinguished older man in a tailored suit, and announced her reservation for a premium balcony suite. The concierge typed her name into the system, smiled politely, and requested a credit card to place on file for the standard security deposit and room incidentals. Suzanne confidently opened her purse and pulled out the heavy metal card linked directly to her concierge bank account, the exact account currently holding $50,000 of stolen medical grant money. She slid the card across the marble counter with a practiced, arrogant flick of her wrist. The concierge inserted the card into the terminal. He waited a few seconds, frowned slightly, and pulled it out. "I am so sorry, madam," the concierge said, his voice quiet to maintain discretion. "The terminal is saying the card is declined. It appears your bank has placed a hard block on the account." Suzanne let out a dramatic, exasperated sigh, visibly annoyed that a minor bureaucratic error was interrupting her luxurious arrival. "That is impossible," she snapped, loudly enough that several other guests turned to look. "I have over $40,000 in liquid cash in that account. Your machine must be broken. Run it again." The concierge, maintaining absolute professional composure, inserted the card a second time. The terminal beeped twice. A red light flashed on the screen. "It is declined again, madam," he said firmly. "The error code specifically states account frozen, suspected fraud. Do you perhaps have another method of payment?" Suzanne's face flushed a deep, embarrassed red. She snatched the card back and frantically pulled out her cell phone, connecting to the hotel's public Wi-Fi. She opened her mobile banking app, fully intending to show the concierge her massive account balance to prove him wrong. She stared at the screen, her thumbs hovering over the glass. Instead of her account dashboard, the app displayed a solid red banner across the top of the screen. The text read, "Account suspended. All assets frozen by federal subpoena. Please contact the United States Financial Crimes Enforcement Network immediately. Reference case file 804B." Suzanne froze. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and shaking in the center of the warm, golden lobby. The reality of the situation had finally pierced through her delusion. She was stranded in a foreign country, thousands of miles away from home, without a single dollar to her name. She looked up at the concierge, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to form a coherent sentence. Before she could speak, two men wearing dark, unassuming suits stepped out from behind a massive marble pillar near the elevators. They walked briskly across the lobby, flanking Suzanne on both sides. They were detectives from the Direction Central de la Police Judiciaire, acting as liaisons for the international warrant filed by Detective Steve. "Suzanne Thomas?" the taller detective asked, his accent thick, but his tone completely uncompromising. Suzanne spun around, her eyes wide with terror, dropping the handle of my leather suitcase. "Yes?" she whispered, clutching her purse to her chest. Are you hotel security? My bank made a terrible mistake. I need to call the American embassy." "We are not hotel security, madam," the detective replied, reaching into his jacket pocket and flipping open a leather wallet to display a silver badge. "We are with the National Police. We have received an expedited extradition warrant from the United States federal authorities. You are being detained under suspicion of grand larceny, identity theft, and international wire fraud." Suzanne's legs gave out. She collapsed against the marble front desk, hyperventilating as the second detective calmly took her by the arm and pulled her back to a standing position. "No!" she screamed, the sound echoing through the elegant lobby, shattering the quiet luxury of the hotel. You cannot arrest me. It was a misunderstanding. It is family money. My sister said I could have it. The detective did not argue with her. He did not care about her sister, and he certainly did not care about her family dynamics. He reached down to his belt, pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, and snapped them tightly around her wrists. The legal fortification was complete. The iron trap had finally snapped shut, locking the predator inside. There are very few things in this world more satisfying than witnessing the absolute collapse of an arrogant ego. When a narcissist is finally forced to face the unvarnished reality of their own actions, the facade of superiority instantly shatters, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, petulant child. The French detectives marched my sister through the center of the Grand Hotel lobby. Her designer sunglasses were knocked askew, her expensive silk scarf dragged across the floor, and she was sobbing hysterically as the other wealthy patrons stopped and stared in utter disgust. She was placed in the back of an unmarked police vehicle and transported directly to a holding facility to await her extradition hearing. Several hours later, my cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown international number. I was sitting in the living room of my house. Leo was asleep in his bedroom, having returned from Sarah's house earlier that evening. The house was perfectly quiet. I answered the phone, keeping my voice completely neutral. "Hello. Laura." Suzanne's voice shrieked through the speaker, frantic and breathless. "Laura, please. You have to help me. The police arrested me at the hotel. They are saying I committed federal wire fraud. You have to call them right now and tell them it is a mistake." I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch across the transatlantic connection, allowing her to hear the absolute lack of sympathy on my end of the line. "It is not a mistake, Suzanne," I said finally, my tone as cold as winter ice. "I am the one who called the fraud division. I gave them the forged authorization form. I gave them your IP address. I gave them your flight itinerary." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "You called the cops on your own sister?" Suzanne whispered, her voice trembling with genuine shock. "Laura, how could you do this to me? I was just going to borrow the money. I was going to pay you back. You are ruining my life over a stupid misunderstanding." "You did not borrow the money, Suzanne," I corrected her, my voice rising slightly, infused with the protective rage of a mother who had finally cornered the predator. "You stole $50,000 from a disabled child. You stole Leo's therapy because you thought you deserved a luxury vacation more than he deserved to learn how to speak." She began to sob loudly into the phone. "Please, Laura, I am so scared. They are going to deport me. They are talking about federal prison. Just call the bank and drop the charges. I am your family. You stopped being my family the moment you forged my signature," I told her, the absolute finality of the statement hanging heavily in the air. "And I cannot drop the charges, Suzanne. This is not a civil dispute. You committed international wire fraud against a medical trust. The federal government has taken over the case. But why did you let me get on the plane?" She wailed, the realization of the trap finally dawning on her. "Why did you not just confront me at the house?" "Because if I confronted you at the house, you would have lied," I explained, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure wash over me. "You would have hidden the money. You would have played the victim. I needed you to board that plane. I needed you to cross international lines so the charges would carry mandatory minimum sentencing. I wanted you to feel exactly what it is like to be completely powerless." I did not wait for her to respond. I hung up the phone and blocked the international number. The conversation was over. The demolition was complete. The aftermath of Suzanne's arrest was swift and devastating. She was extradited back to the United States within 48 hours and handed directly over to the federal authorities. Because the evidence was absolutely incontrovertible, her public defender advised her to accept a plea deal. She was sentenced to 4 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and identity theft. The Carson Foundation easily recovered the frozen funds from the concierge bank account, and the money was successfully routed to the therapy center. Leo started his intensive occupational and speech therapy the following month. By the end of the year, he was speaking in short, complete sentences, his brilliant mind finally given the tools it needed to communicate with the world. My house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely free of toxic entitlement. The quiet karma had done its job perfectly. Lessons from this story. First, stealing from a vulnerable child is the ultimate line of no return. Narcissists often convince themselves they deserve luxury more than someone else deserves basic care, a terrifying delusion that ultimately seals their own fate. Second, the immense tactical power of letting the enemy trap themselves. Instead of warning her sister and allowing her to hide the money, Laura let her board the plane and spend the funds, cementing the federal wire fraud charges with a flawless paper trail. Finally, true justice is entirely devoid of emotion. Tears and arguments will not retrieve stolen funds or change a narcissist's behavior. But a forensic bank audit, an IP log, and a federal detective will ensure the thief never touches a dime again. Do not argue. Simply build the trap and wait for them to step inside.